Do you believe that a dog can reveal the truth about a crime only with its reaction? It sounds like a movie scene, but that's exactly what happened in a courtroom in the United States. Imagine the tension in the air, lawyers exchanging glances, the judge attentive to every detail, and suddenly the presence of a dog completely changes the course of the trial. Have you ever been in a situation where something unexpected has put all certainties in check? Stay with me until the end, because what you will discover now may surprise you. The story I'm going to share shows how animals, especially dogs, are able to perceive far beyond what we can see. They pick up smells, signals, and energies that go unnoticed by most people. And in this particular case, the dog's reaction to a person inside the courtroom stunned everyone. A simple stare, a change of posture, and suddenly, what seemed invisible came to light. It is as if the animal instinct had crossed the barriers of justice to reveal something that no one had the courage to say out loud. Have you ever noticed how dogs can feel when we are nervous, sad, or even when someone is hiding something? Science has already proven that they have a sense of smell millions of times more sensitive than ours, but some say it goes much further than that. In this court, the presence of the dog was not only symbolic, but decisive. While everyone was waiting for logical arguments and concrete evidence, it was the unexpected reaction of the animal that shone a new light on the case. And the most striking thing is that this moment was not in the script, was not part of any legal strategy. It just happened. This episode makes us reflect on the strength of instinct and how often the truth can manifest itself in ways that are beyond human control. Have you ever thought about the emotional impact of seeing an animal react to such a serious situation? The audience was torn between astonishment and the certainty that there was something bigger going on. Suddenly, the words lost their strength before the dog's steady gaze and reaction. And that brings us to another provocative question. To what extent are we prepared to accept that truth can come from where we least expect it? What is even more striking is that even in an environment as rational and formal as a court, dominated by laws, codes, and protocols, it was precisely the instinctive reaction of an animal that put everything in perspective. The silence was broken not by a human statement, but by a canine gesture that no one could ignore. And if you stop to think, maybe that's the real power of dogs, to show that sensitivity and intuition can, yes, reveal what reason tries to hide. Have you ever imagined being in a room full of people, all minutely analyzing every detail, and suddenly realizing that a dog notices something that no one else sees? It is exactly this type of situation that makes us question the limits of human perception and the importance of being attentive to the signs that life gives us. After all, is truth always that which can be proved, or can it also be in what is felt, sensed, instinctive? And here begins an intriguing journey, where every detail matters and every reaction can change the course of history. Because what this dog did in that courtroom was not just an isolated gesture. It was a milestone that put a person's trust, truth, and even fate at stake. Get ready, because what comes next will show how this episode turned into something much bigger than a simple trial. And maybe that's exactly what makes this story so powerful. It's not just about laws or judgments, but about emotions, perceptions, and that instant when everything changes because of an unexpected detail. And speaking in detail, I want to invite you to join this conversation. If this subject makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what has touched you the most so far, or even if you have already lived an experience in which an animal noticed something that no one else noticed. Your vision can further enrich that exchange, and since we are building this space of reflection and connection together, also take the opportunity to enjoy the video. It may seem simple, but each like helps show YouTube that this content has value and deserves to reach more people who, just like you, are open to being surprised by real and exciting stories. And of course, if you feel that this is the kind of content that is worth following closely, subscribe to the channel. It's your way of saying, I want to continue to be a part of this journey. Your participation here is what makes this space grow and strengthen as a true community that believes in the power of stories and the impact they can generate. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next will make it even clearer why this moment in court has become so unforgettable. That courtroom scene didn't come out of nowhere. Behind the dog's unexpected reaction was a story fraught with mystery, pain, and distrust. It all started in a small community that until then lived in relative tranquility. It was the kind of city in which everyone knew, at least by sight, the neighbors, in which secrets seemed difficult to hide, and where any unusual event spread like fire on dry straw. It was in this scenario that a crime shook not only a family, but the entire local population, leaving in the air questions that no one seemed able to answer. The case revolved around a victim whose life seemed normal, but who hid behind the scenes some conflicts that would later prove decisive. News of the crime spread quickly, and within hours the atmosphere of peace was replaced by a mixture of fear, insecurity, and anger. When something like this happens in a small community, the impact goes far beyond the fact itself. It messes with the collective mentality, with the trust between neighbors, with the sense of security that everyone thought was unshakable. Suddenly, people began to look at each other suspiciously, and every detail, no matter how minor, seemed like a potential clue. At the center of this emotional storm was the prime suspect. To some, he was a man of dubious character, someone who carried with him a kind of invisible shadow, as if he always had something to hide. For others, he was nothing more than a scapegoat, someone put in the spotlight just so the community could have a culprit on whom to pour out their frustrations and fears. This division of opinions only added to the tension, turning every bar conversation, every market date, and every family gathering into a space of heated debate. The trial, therefore, was not just about a specific crime, but about an entire city trying to deal with the hidden truth that insisted on remaining in the shadows. What was most striking was the contrast between the victim and the suspect. On the one hand, a person whose public image conveyed fragility and empathy. On the other, someone marked by questionable decisions and eyebrow-raising behavior. This duality made the process take on almost cinematic contours in which every detail seemed worthy of a script. The community, plunged into this atmosphere of suspense, longed for revelations that could finally clarify what in fact had happened. The trial itself became a spectacle. The court was packed every day, as if it were the stage of a play that no one wanted to miss. Local journalists covered his every move, while residents crowded outside, commenting on every gesture, every word, every silence. There were those who compared the experience to a collective journey in search of the truth, even if that truth seemed to hide between layers of contradictory versions, confusing testimonies, and evidence that raised more doubts than offered certainty. In this context, loaded with expectation, the presence of the dog brought an unexpected, almost symbolic element. It was as if nature had invaded the space of the law to expose something that human words could not translate. The reaction of the animal to the suspect not only attracted attention, but also called into question the confidence in the versions put forward until that moment. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any statement. Some jurors exchanged low-key glances, lawyers frowned, and the audience felt a collective shiver run through the room. It was as if, for a brief moment, the mask had fallen, revealing a truth that no one dared to admit out loud. But before this impactful moment, it is critical to understand the background that shaped the case. The city was already experiencing a kind of silent transformation, marked by internal disputes, small family secrets, and old rivalries that, added together, created fertile ground for distrust. When the crime happened, all these elements came to the fore, forming a network of parallel stories that seemed to converge in that courtroom. And as in any community, there were those who defended tooth and nail the innocence of the suspect, while others had full conviction of his guilt. This clash of mentalities divided friends, separated families, and further accentuated the tension that dominated the environment. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because what really underpins the strength of this narrative is not just the crime itself, but the collective impact it has had. The trial became a mirror of the decisions and values of that society. Every detail analyzed seemed to bring with it not only the search for justice, but also revelations about how the community dealt with fear, with uncertainty, and with the need to find a culprit. And it is in this game of perceptions, between what is shown and what is hidden, that the true intensity of this story is built. The victim, whose life seemed stable, had behind-the-scenes choices and relationships that few knew about. The suspect, in turn, carried with him an aura of mystery, as if his own trajectory was marked by constant transformations, sometimes approaching, sometimes moving away from social life. What was discovered little by little is that both were linked in more complex ways than it seemed at first glance, and this made the trial even more emotionally charged. For those who followed everything closely, it was impossible not to feel that there was something bigger at stake, as if the story was much more than a simple crime. There was an implicit message about trust, about the choices we make, and about how at certain times the truth can hide between the lines. The court, in this sense, was only the visible stage of a deeper plot, made up of unspoken feelings, old resentments, and secrets that were about to be revealed. And perhaps this is precisely what grabs our attention so much, the feeling that we are not just hearing about a crime, but about a collective journey in search of answers. The trial, accompanied by suspicious glances, whispers in the corridors and uncomfortable silences, turned into a kind of theater where every gesture had weight, every word could change the course of events. It was as if they were all facing a hidden truth, about to be exposed, but which still resisted showing itself completely. The dog's reaction, which I've cited before, was just the culmination of a story that had been building with layers of tension, expectation, and gradual revelations. To understand its true impact, one must immerse oneself in this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that dominated the city. Only in this way is it possible to understand why that seemingly simple gesture carried so much meaning. And that is exactly why this case has gained such intense proportions, to the point of becoming a milestone in the life of that community. It was not just about finding a culprit or exonerating an accused, but about dealing with the collective ghosts themselves, with the need to see beyond appearances and to accept that often the truth reveals itself in the most unlikely moments. Now, before I move on to the next details that will show how this trial has taken an unexpected turn, I want to make an invitation to you. Comment there, "This makes sense to me," because this way I can understand who is really diving deep into this story along with me. Among all the elements that marked this trial, there was a character that no one expected to see in the spotlight, but which ultimately became decisive: the dog. It was not just an animal present by chance, but a figure that carried with it the emotional charge of the whole story. To some, he was just a sniffer dog, trained to identify signs and smells that escape human understanding. For others, he was the faithful companion of the victim, a being who had shared intimate moments of affection, coexistence, and silence, keeping in himself memories that no witness could reproduce. The fact is that his presence in court did not go unnoticed, and when it comes to impact, this was one of those moments when animal loyalty is mixed with the search for the hidden truth. This dog, described by many as docile and extremely intelligent, carried a deep bond with the victim. The relationship between them was almost symbiotic. Where one was, the other was also. There were those who said that the dog seemed to understand the feelings of its owner with frightening accuracy, reacting to states of sadness, joy, or fear so clearly that it was impossible to ignore. And it was precisely this bond that turned the animal into something beyond a mere spectator. It became an active part of the narrative. Imagine the scene: the courtroom full, the air charged with expectation, and that dog sitting with a steady gaze, as if he were also following every detail of the trial. There was no way not to notice the emotional connection that hung over the room at that instant. Many observers described his posture as serene but attentive, as if he somehow understood the gravity of the moment. This silent presence was almost disturbing, because it reminded everyone that behind the speeches and technical evidence, there were real lives that had been affected. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because when we talk about the participation of a dog in such a situation, we are not just describing the behavior of an animal. We're exploring something that messes with the human mindset, with the decisions we make, and with how we interpret the signals that surround us. A dog's loyalty does not have to be proven in words. It shows itself in gestures, in looks, and in the way he reacts to those he loves or to those who threaten what he protects. And it is precisely this purity that ends up disarming us, making us see truths that we might prefer to avoid. This particular dog had a history that only reinforced its importance. Some reports pointed out that it had been used in search operations, thanks to its keen nose and the ability to follow tracks with almost surgical precision. Others emphasized the emotional side. He was the guardian of the victim, the one who slept at the foot of the bed and who reacted with restlessness whenever he sensed something wrong. These two versions, far from contradicting each other, complemented each other. After all, what was seen in court was precisely the fusion between trained instinct and effective bond. Behind the scenes of the case, Investigators even mentioned how the dog's behavior helped direct some lines of inquiry. There have been situations in which his reaction to certain objects has raised important questions, almost as if pointing to hidden clues. Although science always seeks support in data and material evidence, it is undeniable that, in complex cases, even a seemingly simple detail can cause transformations in the way of conducting an investigation. And here, the detail had 4 paws, attentive eyes, and a memory impregnated with experiences shared with the victim. The impact of this animal on the court was therefore twofold. On the one hand, it brought an emotional element impossible to ignore. On the other, it raised questions about how instincts and perceptions can rather influence the course of a trial. When he reacted in an unexpected way when approaching the suspect, it was not just a bodily movement. It was the materialization of a wounded loyalty, of a connection that seemed to transcend logic. For many present, that moment functioned as a silent revelation, a sign that the truth was there, exposed in the eyes of a dog. It is curious to think how the presence of an animal can change the atmosphere of such a strict place as a court. Normally, what is expected there are rational arguments, documentary evidence, formal testimony. But in that case, it was the silence of a dog that screamed the loudest. It moves us because it reminds us that no matter how hard we try to control narratives, there are forces beyond human control, and animal loyalty is one of those forces. Pure, unbreakable, unquestioning. This episode also makes us reflect on decisions. How many times, faced with difficult situations, do we ignore clear signals just because they do not fit the logic we want to follow? The dog, when reacting to the suspect, showed something that was not written in any document, but that had an immense weight, the emotional memory of everything he lived. This is a kind of hidden truth that only reveals itself when we look beyond the surface. For those who followed the story, it became evident that the dog was not just a curious detail. He was in a way the living link between the victim and justice. His presence constantly reminded everyone that this was not just a legal process, but an interrupted life and broken emotional ties. This brought to the trial a dimension of humanity that would hardly be achieved by technical arguments alone. And when we think of impact, it is impossible not to recognize that this dog has become a symbol of unwavering loyalty, keen instinct, and a journey that could not be ignored. His figure crossed the barriers of the court and marked the collective memory of the community, as if to say, the truth is closer than you imagine, it only takes courage to see it. This courage, by the way, is another fundamental point, because it is not easy to accept that an animal can somehow interfere with the perception of such a serious case. To some, this sounded like superstition or overblown emotion, but for others, it was exactly this sensitivity that brought light to an environment dominated by cold certainties. And the truth is, when it comes to transforming mindsets, it's often the unexpected that causes the biggest changes. Now, as the trial progressed and revelations emerged amid tense testimony and conflicting evidence, that dog stood there, silent, but carrying with it an almost spiritual presence. He didn't have to bark, he didn't have to move all the time. It was enough to be, and to be in such an integral way, that it was enough to make everyone reflect on what was really at stake. And it is precisely in this contrast between the silence of an animal and human noise that the story gains even more strength, because the dog, without saying a single word, revealed more about the essence of the truth than many eloquent speeches. This in itself is already a transformation in the way we understand justice, loyalty, and even the role of emotions in decisive processes. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the trajectory of this dog leads us to think about how effective bonds and instincts can cross borders that we believed impenetrable. He was not only a silent witness to a crime, but an integral part of a larger narrative, which united reason and emotion, justice and humanity, cold decisions and revelations loaded with impact. It's that mix that makes this case so unforgettable, so unlike any other trial. And that is why, to this day, when talking about this court, what comes to mind is not only the testimony, the evidence, or the legal discussions. What remains alive in the collective memory is the image of a loyal dog sitting quietly, but carrying with it a truth that no one could ignore. Right there, I'm on this journey too, because I want to know who is walking along with me in this story that still has a lot to reveal. The courtroom was packed from early on, The seats intended for the audience were occupied in a matter of minutes, and those who arrived late crowded near the doors, trying to find any space through which they could accompany the session. The atmosphere was almost suffocating, a mixture of curiosity, expectation, and fear, as if each person there carried not only the weight of judgment, but also the responsibility of witnessing a historic moment for the community. It was impossible not to feel the charged energy in the air, the kind of energy that makes the heart beat faster, even in those who have no direct connection with the case. The judge entered the room with the firm posture of one who knew that all attention would be focused on him. The silence was immediate, as if every breath had been held at the same time. Behind the bench, the magistrate did not need to raise his voice to command respect. His presence was enough to make it clear that from there every word, every gesture, every revelation would have a profound impact. He was not only conducting a legal process, but mediating a collective journey in search of something greater, the truth. The lawyers, positioned on opposite sides, displayed expressions that revealed much more than they tried to hide. On the one hand, the defense sought to convey serenity, as if the narrative it would present was solid enough to dismantle all the accusations. On the other, the prosecution carried in its gaze the determination of those who believed they had in hand the necessary elements to prove the guilt of the accused. It was almost like watching two strategists preparing the board of a complex game, where every calculated move could mean the difference between freedom and condemnation. The jurors, sitting in silence, carefully observed every detail. They were ordinary people, but at that moment they carried the burden of a decision that would change lives. Their mindset was still anyone's guess. Would they be leaning to one side, or would they really stay neutral to the end? This doubt hung like a shadow over the room, further increasing the tension. The audience, in turn, followed every exchange of glances, every expression, every word spoken in a higher tone, as if everything were a potential clue. Behind the scenes, reporters recorded every detail, ready to turn the courtroom events into headlines that would make their way across town. And in the midst of all this, sitting quietly next to his conductor, was the dog. Silent, attentive, almost motionless, but radiating a presence that seemed greater than that of any witness. Those who watched him had the feeling that he understood what was at stake. It was not just an animal, but a living piece in that puzzle of emotions and secrets. His simple presence brought to light the memory of the victim and reinforced for all present that this trial was not just a clash of laws and arguments, but an attempt to give voice to those who could no longer speak. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the atmosphere of that beginning of the trial was not restricted only to the court. It reflected something bigger, the transformation the entire community was going through. Each person there carried with him not only opinions, but also repressed feelings, personal memories, and even difficult decisions made in the past. When such a crime happens, it is not just the victim who suffers. It is a whole network of relationships, memories, and secrets that is forced to face its own fragility. And this fragility was evident in the details. A lady sitting in the front rows did not stop shaking her trembling hands, as if trying to restrain the whirlwind of emotions that consumed her. Young people quietly whispered, showing curiosity mixed with fear. Men held hard expressions, trying to disguise the discomfort of being in front of something that reminded them of their own vulnerabilities. The hidden truth of the crime, not yet revealed, hung like a shadow that seemed to extend over everyone, making it clear that the trial would not only be about facts, but about perceptions, about mentality, and about collective impact. The first testimonies began, and with them came the emotional shocks. Witnesses were called. Some hesitated before speaking, others showed themselves firmer. But in each account there were loopholes, contradictions, and details that only increased the expectation. It was like watching a narrative under construction, where each piece brought revelations but at the same time left new gaps. The prosecution sought to stitch a logical line, while the defense exploited every point of doubt to weaken the charges. The result was a charged environment in which every word had the power to alter the mindset of jurors. Meanwhile, the accused remained seated, with an enigmatic expression that confused even the most attentive. To some, he seemed too cold, almost indifferent, as if the weight of judgment did not affect him. For others, it was just the reflection of a person trying to maintain control in the face of a situation that could seal their fate. This mystery surrounding their reactions only increased the division among those present. Was there the posture of a guilty trying to disguise, or an innocent crushed by pressure? And there was always the dog. At certain moments he seemed to react discreetly to certain statements. A fixed gaze, a slight movement of the ears, a stronger breath. Small gestures that, although subtle, did not go unnoticed by those who were already emotionally involved with the case. It was impossible not to think of his connection to the victim, and the possibility that those signals were somehow an instinctive response to what was being said. This perception messed with the collective mentality, because it was as if a being incapable of lying was there, silently witnessing. The environment was changing by the minute. The courtroom, which was supposed to be a space of reason and logic, took on almost theatrical contours, where emotions, secrets, and revelations were mixed. It was as if each testimony was one more layer of a hidden truth that everyone longed to see, but which seemed to resist being fully revealed. And in this scenario, the presence of the dog became more and more symbolic, reminding everyone that behind the formality of the processes, there was a lost life and a broken bond of loyalty. This mixture of expectation, tension, and revelations made the trial a real emotional spectacle, in which each person present carried with them their own interpretations. There was no way to remain indifferent. The impact of what was happening was real, and not just for those directly involved, but for everyone who witnessed that moment. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was at stake was not only the innocence or guilt of a person, but the very way the community looked at justice, truth, and even itself. It was a collective journey of transformation, in which every detail, every word, and even silence had weight. Silence. And when we think about this weight, it is impossible not to recognize that that dog sitting in silence carried with him more than many speeches. He was the symbol of all that was yet to come. Comment there. This makes sense to me, because I want to know who is also feeling the weight of this atmosphere along with me, as we continue to dive deeper and deeper into this story. The moment the dog entered the courtroom was described by many as a watershed moment in that trial. By then, the atmosphere was already heavy, marked by tense depositions and the unsettling silence of the jurors. But when the door opened and the animal appeared, led firmly but without losing the naturalness of its movements, all eyes immediately turned to him. There was no one who did not react. Some looked at each other in amazement, others could not disguise their curiosity, and even the lawyers, accustomed to maintaining controlled expressions, let out a brief moment of surprise. It was as if something completely new had invaded that traditionally rigid space, bringing with it an energy that could not be ignored. The dog walked calmly, as if he knew exactly how important it was to be there. His firm footsteps echoed on the ground, and with each movement, the tension seemed to take on new outlines. The audience leaned forward anxiously, trying to capture every detail, while the judges exchanged discreet glances, visibly impacted by the scene. It was unusual, after all, to see an animal in the midst of such a serious legal process, and yet, at that moment, it made sense. It was as if the court had made room for something greater than the formal evidence and the rehearsed words, silent testimony, but loaded with meaning. The judge initially kept his expression impassive, but he could not help but carefully observe the behavior of the animal. It was clear that somehow his presence had already changed the course of the hearing. The lawyers fidgeted in their chairs, mentally assessing how they would handle that unexpected element. After all, the entrance of the dog was not foreseen in any of the previously calculated strategies. It was a new, unpredictable factor that could directly influence the mindset of jurors. Now, I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the impact of this moment cannot be understood only by the scene itself. What was at stake was the transformation of the narrative, the breaking of a pattern that until then had kept everyone stuck to the traditional logic of the process. The dog's entrance represented not just a surprise, but a revelation about how the truth can manifest behind the scenes of a story. He didn't have to talk. He didn't have to justify himself. His mere presence already aroused emotions, memories, and reflections that no human argument could provoke in the same way. The audience, especially those who knew the victim, was gripped by a mixture of nostalgia and commotion. Many remembered the times when the dog accompanied its owner on walks, family parties, or even in the simplest moments of routine. Seeing that animal inside the courtroom was like bringing back a piece of life that had been brutally cut short. It was impossible not to feel the weight of absence and at the same time the strength of loyalty that still remained alive. The defendant, on the other hand, demonstrated a sudden change in his posture. Until that moment, it had remained relatively stable, sustaining calculated expressions that could be interpreted as both coldness and self-control. But the entrance of the dog provoked in him a visible discomfort. His eyes quickly averted, his breathing altered, and small involuntary expressions appeared on his face. It was a subtle detail, but noticeable to everyone who was already attentive to every nuance. That reaction did not go unnoticed, and many in the courtroom felt as if the animal's silence had exposed a hidden truth that had not yet been revealed. The dog, however, didn't seem worried about impressing anyone. He just walked to the destined space, sat quietly and kept his gaze steady, as if he could see beyond appearances. His stance was at once simple and powerful, reminding everyone that the truth often lies not in the long speeches or the evidence displayed on billboards, but in signs that emerge when we least expect it. This contrast between the formality of the court and the naturalness of the animal brought an immediate emotional impact, and even the most skeptical felt the need to reconsider their convictions. For jurors, that moment was disconcerting. The presence of the dog was not part of the instructions they had received, but how to ignore such a gesture loaded with meaning. They were there to analyze evidence, evaluate testimony, and make decisions based on logic and law. However, faced with an animal whose loyalty was unquestioned, the line between reason and emotion became even more blurred. And that was exactly what made that moment so powerful. It exposed the fragility of the very idea of impartiality, showing that we are all, to a greater or lesser extent, influenced by the impact of emotions. This contrast between the expected and the unexpected, between logic and emotion, turned the beginning of the trial into something memorable. The entrance of the dog was like a break in the silent script that everyone believed they were following. Suddenly, everything seemed to be open again, as if every detail could be reinterpreted in light of that unexpected presence. It was as if the journey in search of truth had just gained a new protagonist, a protagonist incapable of lying, but capable of revealing with his simple existence what so many were trying to hide. And what was most impressive was the naturalness with which the animal occupied that space. There was no fanfare, there was no theatrics, just a dog true to its essence, present in a place where it would not normally have space, but which somehow seemed to have more legitimacy than many who were there. This purity, this absence of masks, was what made everyone shut up for a few seconds, absorbing the weight of the scene. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the presence of this dog in court forces us to reflect on our own perceptions. How often do we fail to see clear signs simply because they don't fit our expectations? How often is the truth before us, but we choose to ignore it because it doesn't come in the form we believe is right? This moment was a powerful reminder that justice, like life, is not only made up of rational arguments, but also of instincts, emotions, and revelations that arise when you least expect it. The court would never be the same after the dog entered, and although no one could predict exactly what would happen from there, everyone knew deep down that that instant had already marked history. From then on, the trial would not be remembered only by the testimonies or the evidence presented, but by the image of a dog crossing the door and changing, with its silent presence, the course of events. Right there, I'm on this journey too, because I want to feel who is with me following every detail of this scene that still has a lot to reveal. The silence in the courtroom was already dense, but it gained even greater weight when the dog, sitting quietly until then, made an unexpected movement. His eyes fixed on the defendant in a way that sent shivers down the spine of those nearby. It was not an ordinary look, one of those that animals cast out of curiosity or distraction. It was firm, insistent, almost uncomfortable. The room, which until a few seconds earlier seemed to be stuck only on the words of the lawyers, was now mesmerized by the reaction of a dog that suddenly seemed to know a truth that everyone was trying to reach. The driver, surprised, tried to keep control, but the dog showed increasing tension. He stood up slowly, keeping his gaze straight on the accused, and began to take short, firm steps as if something attracted and repelled him at the same time. With each approach, the defendant seemed to lose some of the stability he had been maintaining since the beginning. His rigid posture fell apart into small involuntary signals, restless hands, accelerated breathing, a look that avoided contact with the animal. For many present, this contrast was disturbing, because it revealed that, even without words, something was being exposed there. And then came the first glaring sign. The dog stopped a few meters from the defendant, fixed itself in front of him, and began to emit a low growl, barely noticeable at first, but charged with intensity. It was not a common behavior in a controlled environment, especially for an animal that had shown calm until that moment. The growl was enough to provoke a murmur in the audience, followed by looks exchanged between jurors, lawyers, and even the judge, who leaned forward in his chair, as if trying to decipher what that gesture meant. The defendant's reaction was immediate, a sudden recoil movement, almost instinctive, as if he had been taken by surprise by something he could not explain. His eyes, though they tried to disguise it, revealed fear. Fear not only of the animal, but of what its reaction might suggest in front of everyone watching. This seemingly simple detail transformed the environment. The court, hitherto dominated by calculated speeches, had just witnessed a scene that went completely off script. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was at stake was not only the reaction of a dog before a person, it was the breaking of an invisible barrier, the exposure of a hidden truth that no testimony or technical evidence had been able to reveal until that moment. The dog's behavior wasn't just instinctual, it was charged with an emotional bond with the victim and a sensitivity that defied human logic. He did not react to roles, did not evaluate arguments, did not allow himself to be influenced by rehearsed narratives. His perception was direct, raw, based on something that went beyond any disguise. This episode profoundly affected the collective mentality present in the courtroom. For some, the dog's gesture had no legal relevance, it could not be considered concrete evidence. But for most, the emotional impact was overwhelming. How to ignore an animal that until then calm reacted so intensely precisely in front of the suspect? It was impossible not to wonder, was this just a coincidence or a sign that there was more behind the appearances? The backstage of the trial recorded the tension of that moment as one of the most striking of the entire hearing. Reporters took notes frantically, trying to capture in words the scene that in itself already carried enough force to shake convictions. Lawyers whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the unpredictability of the moment, and jurors, though instructed to maintain impartiality, could not hide the impact that behavior had on their perception. It was as if the court had been transported beyond the walls of the law, into a sphere where emotion and instinct spoke louder than any technical argument. The dog, after a few moments of tension, emitted a firm, strong and lonely bark, which echoed through the hall like a call impossible to ignore. The sound reverberated not only in the ears of those who were present, but in the depths of each one, reminding us that no matter how hard we tried to control narratives, the truth sometimes manifests itself in a direct, unexpected, and even uncomfortable way. That single bark seemed to sum it all up. There was something wrong, something that needed to be faced, and no human silence could erase that signal. The defendant, again, reacted visibly. A cold sweat trickled down his forehead, his hands trembled slightly, and his attempt to maintain his composure became increasingly fragile. The defense quickly tried to soften the impact, asking the judge not to allow the animal's reaction to be interpreted as evidence. But the damage was already done. The image of the dog growling and barking in front of the accused had fixed itself in everyone's mind. It was impossible to erase this scene, impossible to disregard the symbolic weight it carried. And this is where the question becomes even deeper. What we witnessed in that instant was not just animal behavior, but a revelation about how our own decisions are influenced by signals that escape the rational. The mentality of jurors, the public and even legal professionals was being shaped at that moment, faced with something that logic did not explain, but that intuition did not allow to ignore. This is the power of the unexpected, of what emerges from behind the calculated scenes, bringing to light truths that insist on hiding. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because this first interaction of the dog with the suspect opened the way for a series of questions, not only about the case, but about how we deal with revelations that defy our standards. To what extent do we trust our instincts? To what extent do we allow emotions to interfere with decisions that require rationality? The court on that day became not only a trial stage, but also a mirror of our own contradictions. The scene had made it clear that no matter how hard we tried to maintain control, there were forces beyond our hands at work there. And that recognition, even silent, changed the dynamics of the trial forever. Comment there. That makes sense to me. because I want to realize who is also grasping the weight of this moment that is yet to unfold into even more intense revelations. What already seemed to have been a turning point inside the courtroom gained an almost unbearable intensity when the dog's behavior ceased to be just a low, controlled growl. That initial reaction, which had already shaken those present, now turned into something much bigger, as if the animal instinct had decided to take on the role of protagonist amid the clash of human arguments. The barking that echoed through the room was not just a sound. It was a break in the rigid structure of a trial that, until then, had walked within the rules of protocol. It was as if the hidden truth, which everyone sought with such difficulty, had finally found a way to manifest itself, and it would not be through words. The silence afterwards was not the same as before. It wasn't just expectation. It was as if everyone present felt at the same time that something extraordinary was about to happen. The eyes turned to the animal, attentive to its every movement, as if waiting for a revelation beyond human control. And the dog did not take long to confirm this feeling. He stood up again, with steps that seemed to carry an invisible energy, firm and determined, as if drawn by an inevitable force in the direction of the defendant. The scene was almost cinematic. The defendant tried to keep his composure, but with each step of the dog, his mask began to fall apart. His breathing grew heavier, his gaze strayed to all sides, and a cold sweat trickled down his skin, betraying the internal struggle to maintain the appearance of tranquility. It was as if his body, no matter how hard it tried to obey the rational command to stand firm, was being exposed by the animal's instinct. And it was this contrast between the silence of reason and the cry of instinct that made it all the more disturbing. It was at that moment that the barking returned, this time more insistent. They were not empty barks, but directed, charged with intent. It was as if the dog was pointing, denouncing, marking an invisible territory of truth that no one else could reach. Every sound reverberated in the room like a dry blow, hitting the jurors, the judge, the audience, all at the same time. There was no one who was not touched by that reaction. The murmurs began to grow. People looked at each other in amazement, hands covered their mouths in disbelief, and even the judge, who should be the most balanced figure, leaned forward, with the serious and suspicious expression of someone who realized that this was not just an irrelevant detail. The dog's handler, trained to maintain control in adverse situations, seemed to struggle with the energy the animal radiated. He pulled the leash, gave low commands, tried to convey serenity, but there was not enough strength to contain what seemed to be more than simple behavior. The dog scratched the ground with its front paws, advanced towards the defendant whenever he made a movement, and did not look away for a single instant. It was as if he saw something beyond what human eyes could see. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was happening in front of everyone was not just an unusual court scene. It was the materialization of what we often call intuition, only this time expressed in the form of pure instinct. The dog was not aware of the legal consequences, did not make strategic calculations, did not care about narratives. He reacted in a genuine way, guided by memories, by the effective bond with the victim, and by the invisible perception he carried with him. This authenticity is what crossed those present, because there was no way to doubt the sincerity of an animal that has no masks, has no hidden interests, does not manipulate. The defendant, increasingly pressed, began to move restlessly. His hands crossed and uncrossed in a nervous gesture. The collar of his shirt was adjusted again and again. His shoulders arched as if trying to shrink before the dog's fixed gaze. It was a body that spoke more than any defense could articulate. And this mismatch between the rational attempt to remain calm and the instinctive reaction of those who saw themselves exposed only reinforced the feeling that there was something to be revealed. The whole court plunged, every second, deeper into an atmosphere of absolute suspense. It was no longer an ordinary trial, but a stage on which emotion and truth were mixed in an overwhelming way. The audience no longer saw just an animal reacting. They saw a symbol, a messenger of something greater. It was as if the dog carried in itself the silenced voice of the victim, bringing out a revelation that could no longer be contained. The jurors, despite the obligation to maintain neutrality, were visibly shaken. Some leaned forward, eyes fixed on the dog, as if seeking to confirm with their own senses what they were witnessing. Others exchanged looks of doubt and discomfort, trying to keep their minds logical in the face of an event that defied reason. But in common there was the recognition that that moment could not be ruled out. The behavior of the animal weighed as much as any testimony that had been given until then. And then came the apex. The dog, after a few minutes of increasing restlessness, resolutely advanced to the defendant's table. With a sudden leap, he leaned on his hind legs and rose to the surface, staring the accused directly in the eyes. His barks echoed loud, repeated, reverberating through the courtroom walls like an unwritten sentence. It was impossible not to feel the force of that moment, impossible not to interpret that gesture as an instinctive recognition of something that everyone was looking for. The judge asked for an order. Lawyers stood up in desperation, trying to intervene, but it was too late. The image was already etched in the collective memory. That dog, with its loyalty and instinct, had just completely transformed everyone's perception. What once seemed like a trial conducted within legal logic now bore the mark of an extraordinary event, a watershed that no one would ever forget. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the intensification of the dog's behavior is not just a curious detail of the narrative, it's a milestone. He revealed, without words, what many already suspected, but did not have the courage to admit that the truth is not only hidden in documents or formal testimonies, but also in the signs that emerge from where we least expect it. This moment was proof that there are invisible layers of perception that can change not only a trial, but the mindset of everyone who witnesses it. The emotional impact was so intense that the subsequent silence seemed to reverberate the barking still inside each person's mind. It was as if everyone was trying to process what they had actually witnessed, knowing deep down that that instant had changed the course of history. The court would never be seen the same way again. Comment there. This makes sense to me, because I want to feel who was also touched by the strength of this instant, when instinct spoke louder than any words. The tension that had built up in the courtroom after the dog's reaction did not dissipate easily. On the contrary, it seemed to increase every second, as if everyone was waiting for a plausible explanation for what they had witnessed. The defendant, still uncomfortable, struggled to regain his composure, but his image was already deeply scratched. The jurors, visibly shaken, exchanged glances that denounced a collective impact difficult to erase. It was at this point that the voice of the experts became crucial, because without an interpretation, that scene could be dismissed as mere coincidence or simple animal instinct. And it was precisely at this moment that lawyers, investigators, and even specialized coaches began to speak out. The prosecutor was the first to use the episode as part of his narrative, firmly stressed that this was not just a random reaction, but a behavior consistent with the function of a trained sniffer dog. He explained, in detail, how these animals are able to identify specific odors, even molecules left by human contact with objects or people. In several countries, dogs had already been recognized as legitimate investigative tools, participating in operations that saved lives and solved complex cases. His speech had a tone of authority that resonated directly in the minds of the jurors, reinforcing the credibility of the scene that had just taken place. On the other side, the defense tried to minimize the impact. They argued that the animal could have reacted to the defendant's nervousness, involuntary gestures, or even a neutral smell that would have no connection with the crime. They tried to paint the scene as an emotional spectacle that could not be mistaken for concrete evidence. But the more they tried to rationalize, the more the image of the dog growling and barking gained strength in the collective imagination. After all, it was impossible to erase the intensity of that instant from the memory of those present. It was then that the investigators brought their vision. One of them, with years of experience in criminal operations, explained to the court how dogs are used in serious procedures, not only to find drugs or explosives, but also to detect odors related to human blood, weapons, or even the presence of a person in specific places. He reported cases where dogs had found decisive clues that technology could not identify. And in this context, the animal's reaction in court gained a new dimension. It was not just an instinct, but a trained reflex that could be pointing directly to the hidden truth of that trial. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the presence of experts not only validated what the public had seen, but also transformed the collective perception of the role of the dog. Suddenly he was no longer just the faithful companion of the victim, carrying the emotional memory of an unbreakable bond. It also became a kind of living proof, legitimized by science and the professional experience of those who worked with canine investigations and training. This combination of emotion and authority gave the animal a weight that no human witness had yet achieved. One of the coaches present was asked to give his opinion. He explained that dogs have an olfactory sensitivity capable of identifying odors even after days, weeks, or months, something that would be impossible for humans. He pointed out that in court cases, this capacity had already been used as part of investigation strategies in several countries, precisely because the reliability of the canine nose is extremely high. But the most striking detail came when he mentioned the emotional bond. A dog that has lived closely with a person can react even more intensely to the presence of someone who poses a threat or who has had direct contact with his life or death. This explanation seemed to fit perfectly into the scene everyone had just witnessed. The impact of this was immediate. People in the courtroom began to regard the dog not just as an instinctively reacting animal, but as a direct bridge to the truth. It was as if he carried in himself both the scientific legitimacy and the emotional force of a broken bond. That combination made him more convincing than any human testimony to date. The jurors, though instructed to analyze hard facts, knew deep down that that scene had planted a seed that was hard to ignore. The defense, in its bid to regain control, brought in an expert of its trust to suggest that the animal could be reacting to the stress of the environment or even to generic odors of human nervousness, such as sweat and adrenaline. But the argument sounded fragile in the face of the intensity they had all witnessed. It was hard to believe that such insistence of the dog, growls, scratches, directed barking, and the gesture of rising against the defendant's table was just the fruit of chance or shared nervousness. The audience, for the most part, had already taken an emotional side, and even the most skeptical could not detach themselves from the idea that there was something deep and true being revealed. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because what was happening was not just the validation of an animal behavior, but the transformation of the narrative of the trial. Until that moment, speeches were guided by logic, by formal proofs, by rehearsed versions. But with the entry of the experts, the court began to recognize that the truth could be hidden in unconventional signals, in perceptions that defy the limits of human reason. This change of mindset was crucial. It widened the space of interpretation, allowing emotion, instinct, and science to coexist on the same stage. This episode also makes us reflect on the impact that symbols have on our collective journey. Because, more than an animal reacting, the dog became an icon, a point of convergence between faith, science, and justice. His reaction could no longer be ignored or reduced to a detail, and the experts' explanation gave everyone the assurance that they were not just being carried away by emotion, but witnessing something real, legitimate, backed up by those who deeply understood the subject. From there, the court looked different. The weight of the dog's presence grew exponentially, turning every future gesture into a sign to be interpreted. The trial was no longer just a contest between defense and prosecution. It was also a journey of revelation in which even the silence and restlessness of an animal could carry more truth than carefully chosen human words. And it was precisely this that left everyone in suspense, the feeling that what had happened up to that moment was only the beginning. Because if the dog was really reacting to the presence of the real culprit, what else could come to light in the following moments? What other layers of truth were still hidden behind the scenes of this case? Comment there. I'm on this journey too, because I want to know who is feeling the weight of this transformation along with me as we continue to dive deeper and deeper into this story. The impact of the dog's behavior was not just momentary. It reverberated throughout the courtroom like a wave that no one could contain. The judge, until then rigid and serene, began to observe every detail with even more attention, as if he were facing something that required more than simple registration in the records. His posture changed, and the weight of responsibility became even more evident in his eyes. The jurors, in turn, were no longer just passive listeners. After the scene with the dog and the interpretation of the experts, they began to follow each testimony with a renewed eye, looking for connections that had not seemed so relevant before. It was as if that instant had transformed the collective mentality of the room, opening space for new interpretations that changed the course of the trial. Suddenly, evidence that had been presented in an almost bureaucratic way began to gain unexpected importance. Objects discarded as secondary returned to the center of attention. Statements that previously seemed inconsistent began to be reconsidered, and even contradictions in the reports, previously treated as minor details, began to be analyzed in another depth. The dog had unwittingly become a kind of catalyst for revelations, forcing everyone to reevaluate what had already been exposed. The court breathed another air, denser, more charged with expectation, because everyone knew that nothing else would be interpreted in the same way. The prosecutor, noticing this change, took the opportunity to highlight points that had been almost forgotten until then. He retook objects found at the crime scene, highlighted testimonies that mentioned the proximity of the defendant to the victim at critical moments, and used the dog's reaction as a symbol of something greater, the invisible link between instinct and truth. The defense, on the other hand, struggled to make up ground, trying to divert attention from the animal and bringing technical arguments to reinforce the idea that emotion should not override reason. But try as they might, the symbolic weight of that episode was greater than any rehearsed speech. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what happened in court goes beyond a simple change of focus. It was a real transformation in the power dynamics within the room. Until that moment, the lawyers dictated the rhythm with their rehearsed speeches. The testimonies followed an expected script, and the judge only mediated. But with the presence and reaction of the dog, the logic of the trial broke down. The unexpected gained space, and this space revealed a hidden truth that forced everyone to confront their own convictions. This is the kind of event that shows us how important decisions can be influenced, not only by what is said, but also by what is felt and perceived intuitively. The public also reacted with intensity. Many present murmured among themselves, recalling details that had previously gone unnoticed. There were those who said that the defendant already showed signs of nervousness from the beginning, but no one had given it such importance until they saw the reaction of the dog. Others commented on how the victim had always been close to the animal, and how this bond gave even more strength to the episode. It was an exchange of perceptions behind the scenes that somehow also reached the judges, further fueling the atmosphere of suspense and expectation. The judge, aware of the collective impact, had to intervene several times to maintain order. But even his attempts to control the situation sounded different. He couldn't just erase what had happened. His most rigid expression gave way to moments of silent reflection, as if even he were forced to admit that the scene with the dog had opened a new layer of interpretation impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about upholding the law, but about ensuring that the truth emerged from wherever it was hidden. And the jurors, the ones who would have the ultimate responsibility, were clearly transformed. Some took notes more vigorously, others stared at the defendant whenever the dog reacted, and there were even those who showed emotions that they tried to hide behind neutral expressions. What once seemed like an ordinary judgment was already becoming an emotional journey, a process in which instinct, reason, and emotion were inevitably intertwined. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because this impact shows us something that goes beyond the court. It reveals how in any human journey, there are moments when symbols, gestures, or unexpected events change the course of our decisions. Often a truth that was hidden only comes to light when something breaks the pattern, when the unexpected arises to force us to look differently at what was already before us. This episode with the dog was exactly that, a rupture that brought clarity, albeit painful to everyone who was present. This clarity did not mean a definite conclusion, but it made room for new possibilities. The court, which until then had been guided by predictable paths, now found itself facing a bifurcation, in which each decision would have an even greater impact. The dog's reaction had shed light on forgotten points, and now everyone had the feeling that they were closer to something real, more authentic. It was as if the animal had put everyone in front of a mirror, forcing them to face questions that until then they had preferred to avoid. And it was in this climate of expectation that the trial followed, with each new testimony, each new evidence, being reinterpreted in light of what had happened. No one could separate what was logical from what was symbolic, because the two were already definitively intertwined. And this fusion, at once unsettling and revealing, was what gave the feeling that everyone was about to witness something much greater than a simple verdict. Right there. I'm on this journey too, because I want to feel who is closely following each change in this atmosphere that still has much more to reveal. With every minute that passed after the dog's reaction, the courtroom seemed to turn into a living organism, pulsating with expectation and tension. The silence wasn't just absence of sound. It was as if each breath was suspended, condensing glances, thoughts, and fears into a space too small to hold so much energy. The judge, aware of the weight of that moment, authorized that the evidence be represented now under a new look. Objects that had previously been treated as mere details, a stained piece of clothing, a crumpled note, an almost invisible trace gained new outline, as if the dog had illuminated points forgotten by formal logic. The audience followed in ecstasy, and the jurors, who until then seemed anesthetized by the repetition of testimony, began to analyze every detail with renewed fervor. It was as if everyone had suddenly been awakened to the possibility that the truth had always been before them, only obscured by the excess of formalities. In this climate of revelations, the dog's reaction echoed again in everyone's mind. When they brought certain objects closer to the table, the animal reacted again, not in a scattered, but in a concentrated way, stiffening its body, growling low, emitting firm barks. Each sound felt like an unspoken word, a direct accusation that needed no translation. Experts reinforced what they had already explained. Dogs are able to identify odors that persist in tiny particles, traces invisible to us. One of the investigators cited previous cases in which dogs had solved crimes by detecting imperceptible traces on discarded weapons or clothes washed several times. This contextualization gave even more credibility to what the court was witnessing. It wasn't a coincidence. It was no accident. It was science and instinct merging into one inescapable revelation. The defendant, faced with this, lost what little control he had left. Until that moment, her body language had only been uncomfortable. Now, it was desperate. His hands trembled incessantly. His mouth dried up to the point that he had to moisten it all the time, and his gaze could no longer fix anywhere. He avoided the dog with all his might, as if that animal gaze was able to pierce through his masks and touch directly on his guilt. The defense, already under pressure, insisted that no evidentiary value could be attributed to animal behavior, but the argument seemed fragile in the face of the symbolic force that unfolded in front of everyone. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because this moment went beyond the technical sphere. The court had ceased to be just a space for formal evidence to become a stage for collective transformation. The mentality of the jurors, the public, and even the judge himself was no longer the same. They were faced with the fusion of emotion and rationality, instinct and science, and in this interweaving emerged the hidden truth that everyone was looking for. It was as if every element, every seemingly insignificant detail, was now part of a living web of revelations. The climax came when they brought a personal object of the victim, kept for months as irrelevant, a handkerchief with discrete marks found in the house of the accused. Until then, it had been considered a minor detail, easily explained by the proximity he said he had with his family. But the instant the handkerchief was placed on the table, the dog exploded in reaction. He growled loudly, stepped forward, pulled the leash tightly to get closer, barking insistently as if to say, "Here is the link. Here is the truth." The whole room held its breath. The defendant at that moment could no longer sustain the mask he had been carrying as armor. His face paled to such an extent that it seemed to empty of blood. The eyes grew dizzy involuntarily, and the breathing became short and irregular. Then, in a gesture that no one expected, he brought his hands to his face and babbled disconnected words, laden with guilt and despair. It was not a planned confession, but the emotional breakdown of someone cowed, exposed not only by the material evidence, but by the unwavering presence of a dog that seemed to carry in itself the memory of the victim. The defense tried to restrain him, asking for silence, claiming that one could not consider those words under pressure, but it was too late. The court had witnessed what it needed. The judge asked for order in the room, hitting the hammer hard, but even his authority could not erase the collective impact of that instant. The audience murmured in shock, some people openly cried, and even the most restrained jurors could not hide their emotion. It was as if everyone had understood in unison that they were before the revelation of truth. That instant, charged with raw emotion, was much more than formal justice. It was the meeting of instinct, memory, and courage. It was the collective impact of a symbol that outweighed any attempt at rational manipulation. The confession, however fragmented and confused, brought with it a wave of contradictory feelings. There was relief at the clarification, there was pain at the confirmation of guilt, there was disbelief at witnessing something so unusual. The dog finally calmed down, He sat next to his conductor and maintained the serenity of one who had accomplished his mission. His stance conveyed a silent message. There was nothing left to prove. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the revelation that took place in that court went beyond the boundaries of the case itself. It showed that the truth can remain hidden for a long time, but that it always finds a way to emerge, and often that way is not what we expect. This episode has become a powerful reminder that justice is not only the result of technical evidence, but also the courage to interpret signals that, however uncomfortable, carry in themselves the essence of reality. The transformation was collective. Each person there came out different, marked by the recognition that they would never look at justice the same way again. But the confession didn't just bring closure. On the contrary, it opened a new box of questions. To what extent was the community prepared to accept that an animal had been the crucial link in unmasking a criminal? What implications would this have on future trials? How would this case be remembered in the next generations? And above all, what other truths remain hidden, waiting only for the right gesture, the right look, or the right instinct to come to light? These questions echoed in the room like ghosts that would still need answers. And while everyone wondered about the future, the scene of the dog next to the table, serene after exposing the truth, had already become eternal in the collective memory. A symbol of instinct, loyalty, and justice, reminding everyone that truth always finds its way, albeit by unexpected means. Comments there. This makes sense to me, because I want to feel who also realized the weight of this revelation and understood how instinct, emotion, and truth can walk together in the same destiny. The revelation of the truth had shocked everyone, but what followed in court was something that transcended any ordinary judgment. After the emotional breakdown of the defendant and the fragmented confession that left the room in silence, the eyes again turned to the dog. That animal, which until recently seemed only an unusual presence amid the formality of the court, was now recognized as the fundamental piece that had triggered the transformation of the entire process. It took no words to make this clear. The respectful silence that filled the room had the force of an invisible applause, charged with admiration and gratitude. And then spontaneously someone started clapping. First a timid sound, almost restrained by the solemnity of the environment. Soon after, another joined in. In a matter of seconds, the entire court was applauding. Jurors, public, even some officers who kept order, surrendered to the impulse to recognize the loyalty and intelligence of that four-legged hero. It was a rare moment when legal protocol bowed to collective emotion. It wasn't just about justice, it was about humanity, about the ability to recognize in an animal's instinct what human eyes took so long to see. The dog, oblivious to the formalities, remained seated with calm breathing and serene gaze. Perhaps he did not understand the scope of that gesture, but he carried in his posture a silent dignity that seemed to dialogue directly with the hearts present there. His calmness conveyed the feeling of mission accomplished. While many became emotional, quietly crying or smiling amid relief, the dog remained as always out, simple, loyal, and true. It was as if his presence reminded everyone that behind every judgment there are lives, emotions, and bonds that cannot be reduced to roles and numbers. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what was being celebrated at that moment was not just a judicial outcome, but a revelation about how symbols have the power to transform mentalities. That dog became an icon, not only because it helped expose the truth, but because it represented something greater: the unconditional loyalty, the purity of intentions, the silent courage of those who do not need words to show whose side they are on. This public recognition was not only about him, it was also about all the invisible ties that bind humans and animals together on journeys of trust and protection. The judge, sensitized, allowed the atmosphere of emotion to continue for a few moments. It was unusual to make room for such demonstrations inside a courtroom, but that day, the cold logic of the rules gave way to something bigger. It was impossible to contain. Even the magistrate, whose job it was to maintain order, seemed to understand that this applause was part of the very justice being done. And this brought an even deeper impact. For the first time, the judicial process was not being marked only by the words recorded in minutes, but by the collective recognition that an animal had been fundamental in the search for truth. The jurors, who bore the brunt of the decision, could not resist the commotion. Some quietly wiped their eyes, others kept firm expressions, but all shared the same feeling. The case had only reached that point thanks to the instinct and courage of a dog. This emotional trigger united the entire room, dissolving for a few minutes the barriers between prosecution, defense, judge, and community. All were connected by the same perception that they were facing an unlikely but indisputable hero. Behind the scenes, journalists recorded every detail. The cameras would capture the moment the dog received applause, and those images, they knew, would become historic. Not only because of the uniqueness of the scene, but because they symbolized something rare: the convergence between justice and emotion, between law and instinct, between the rational and the symbolic. This merger would be remembered as a watershed, not only for the community, but for all who believe that the truth, sooner or later, finds a way to be revealed. The audience, in turn, put aside for a few minutes the tension accumulated during the process. The collective applause was also a vent, a way to release the weight they had carried since the beginning of the trial. It was as if, in recognizing the dog, they also recognized the possibility of believing again in justice, of trusting that there are forces that, even when they seem invisible, work to bring the truth to the surface. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was happening in that court went beyond the sphere of law. It was a powerful reminder that transformation doesn't just happen when a sentence is passed, but also when hearts and minds are touched so intensely that they are never the same again. Applauding that dog was, in essence, applauding loyalty, courage, and purity, values we often forget amid the cold rationality of decisions. And that moment became unforgettable because, more than a trial, it was the consecration of a truth that united everyone in the same emotion. When the applause stopped, the silence that filled the room was no longer the same as before. There was no tension, but reverence. Each person there understood that he had witnessed something unique, something that could not be explained by legal rules alone. The dog, Serene, did not seek recognition, but received it as if it were inevitable. And at that moment, everyone understood that justice is not only built with arguments, but also with symbols that remind us of the essence of life. Right there, I'm on this journey too, because I want to feel who is walking with me in this recognition that loyalty and courage, even from a four-legged hero, can forever change the way we see the truth. The recognition of that four-legged hero did not end only with applause in court. It spread like waves on a lake after a stone touches the surface. Newspapers, magazines, and television programs began to report the case with enthusiasm, highlighting not only the legal outcome, but the symbolic force of an animal that, without speeches or artifices, managed to expose a hidden truth. The community came to see that dog no longer as just a faithful companion, but as a protagonist of a journey that transformed the collective perception of loyalty, instinct, and justice. It was impossible not to be moved to imagine the impact that a simple gesture guided by the nose and the heart had caused in so many lives. The streets of the city commented. People who might have never set foot in a courtroom discussed the scene as if they had been inside. Some spoke of the defendant, others of the evidence, but they all came back to the same point: the dog. He had become a living symbol, a reminder that truth finds ways to manifest itself even when words fail. In conversations on street corners, on coffee wheels, and even in classrooms, this episode was used as an example of courage and connection between worlds that often seem separate, the human and the animal. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this story makes us reflect on how we underestimate what we cannot fully explain. Often we are so caught up in structures, rules, and cold analysis that we forget about intuition, subtle signals, revelations that come from where we least expect it. The dog, in reacting to the defendant, was not only bringing up a detail of the case, but teaching a lesson in mentality, that one must pay attention to the invisible, to that which is not written on papers, but which pulsates in reality around us. This kind of impact is not limited to courts. It extends to life, to the decisions we make daily, and to the moments when we need to acknowledge the truth that insists on revealing itself, even if it hurts. The judge, the jurors, and everyone present left that room different from how they entered. It was as if they had participated not only in a trial, but in a collective transformation. A reminder that justice is not only made of laws, but also of courage, insight, and humanity. This understanding left invisible marks, which would remain far beyond the formal closure of the process. After all, there was a hero in that court, and he did not wear a toga, did not carry documents, did not speak. He had 4 paws, a keen nose, and a heart that beat with unwavering loyalty. This case showed that heroes can have 4 legs and a sensitivity that we could never imagine. And perhaps this is what thrills us the most, to realize that amid the rationality that guides our social structures, there is still room for the unexpected, for the pure instinct that disarms even the most well-constructed masks. It's a powerful revelation because it reminds us that no matter how hard we try to hide, the truth always finds a way. Sometimes through documents, sometimes through people, but in extraordinary cases, through a dog that has not accepted to be silent in the face of injustice. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this story tells not only about the court, but about how we deal with our own journeys. How often do we ignore clear signals for fear of facing what they mean? How often do we let apparent logic override the emotional truth that screams within us? The scene of this dog reminds us that no matter how hard we try to rationalize, there are times when we need to trust what we feel, what cannot be explained in words, but which is impossible to deny. This is the mentality that transforms, that opens doors to new decisions and that changes the course of life. With each shared account, with each person who was moved by this story, a sense of community was also born. It wasn't just about that dog, but about what he represented to everyone. The certainty that loyalty still exists, that courage doesn't depend on size or voice, and that truth can manifest even where we least expect it. This strengthened invisible bonds, creating a network of people who somehow felt part of this journey. And that's the point that makes this narrative so unforgettable. It's not just a closed case, but an impact that remains echoing far beyond the courtroom. It leads us to reflect on our own inner battles, on the times when we need courage to face revelations, on the times when we underestimate the strength of those who are at our side. A dog, with its simplicity and instinct, showed us that the truth cannot be hushed up. And this is a teaching that transcends the case, reaching every person who heard or witnessed this scene. If this story touched you, leave it here in the comments. This makes sense to me. I want to feel who also understood that sometimes the greatest heroes do not speak our language, but they manage to transform our lives in a way that we will never forget. And if you made it this far, it's because this story made sense to you in some way too. So take advantage of this moment and subscribe to the channel, because I always bring content that touches the bottom, that bring reflections, and show how life is full of twists and unexpected revelations. Oh, and leave your like, because it shows that we are connected in the same energy and helps me to continue bringing stories like this to you. And since we are together until the end, right there in the comments, I'm with you until the end. I will love to know who really walked with me on this journey so far. There is a video here on the side that complements this topic and further deepens this conversation. Click and stay with me there.